Owen Hart had never thought of himself as someone who needed to make noise to be noticed. For most of his life, silence had been a companion rather than a void, comforting, constant, and unintrusive. His land, a sprawling 200-acre property nestled against the forested borderlands of northern Oregon, reflected that same quiet temperament. Passed down from his grandfather and maintained by Owen's hands over the past 2 decades, the estate was a patchwork of mossy glades, trickling seasonal creeks, and dense pine corridors so thick they filtered sunlight into dim, cathedral-like rays. There were no welcome signs, no manicured driveways, and no fences that served aesthetic purposes. The property lines were clearly marked in the county's registry, and that was enough for Owen. He knew every rock, every tree, every game trail that veered through the ridges. He'd built blinds, small wooden observation towers, and hideaways not for recreation but for population studies, traditional hunting, and habitat monitoring, a holdover from his years consulting on natural land use. For Owen, the land was both refuge and responsibility. He treated it as such, regulating his own movements with the respect of someone who recognized that ownership didn't mean domination. Hunting was part of that responsibility. Not for sport, and certainly not for trophies. He hadn't mounted a head in 20 years, but for balance. Coyotes, when left unchecked, would decimate rabbit and vole populations and, by extension, harm the forest's soil integrity. Owen had studied the patterns, worked with biologists in the past, and abided by every legal requirement: seasonal tags, ballistic registration, state land use reporting. He followed the law not out of fear of consequence but because the rules, in this case, made sense. So when he pulled the trigger that morning, standing at the edge of a grove as mist clung to the undergrowth and a single male coyote stepped into the open, he felt neither triumph nor apprehension. The shot was clean, humane, purposeful. He walked the carcass back to the cabin, tagged and logged the kill in his binder, and resumed his day with the same deliberate, quiet pace that governed all his routines. The letter arrived 2 days later, printed on heavy stock paper with a gold-accented letterhead and a tone so self-righteous it practically bled through the envelope. It accused him, in officious language, of discharging firearms in proximity to a community recreation zone, of disturbing public tranquility, and, most curiously, of hunting without community authorization on regulated shared land. It was signed, not by a sheriff or state game warden, but by a group calling itself the Pinebrook Ecological Association, a name Owen had never encountered before. He reread the letter 3 times before setting it aside and pacing his porch with slow, measured steps. He had not left his land. No one else had rights to it. He had never granted an easement or agreed to any regulatory oversight beyond state conservation codes. And yet the implication was clear. Someone believed they had the authority to govern what he did on his own soil. It wasn't until he drove into town later that week, his first time off the property in almost a month, that he overheard a conversation outside the feed store that made his stomach turn. A woman was talking about the incident in the woods, how some local kids had been on a community hike when they heard a gunshot and saw an animal being dragged through the dirt. There were children involved, she said. It was terrifying. No one should be allowed to bring weapons so close to a public trail. Owen didn't interrupt. He recognized the tone of someone who had already decided the facts and wasn't interested in nuance. But he listened. She mentioned a name. Karen Holbrook. She'd seen it happen, apparently. Or at least that was what she told the board at the last meeting. Karen lived 3 properties down, though Owen wouldn't have recognized her if she stood in front of him. She had moved in 5 years ago with a husband who, according to town gossip, had vanished just as quickly as he'd appeared. Since then, she'd become increasingly vocal at community meetings, advocating for green integration, neighborhood fitness routes, seasonal fairs, and everything else Owen avoided like a rash. She wasn't evil. He didn't believe in such simplistic terms. But she was persistent, self-important, and dangerously good at turning opinions her way. If she said she saw him hunting where people walked, Others would believe her, even if it wasn't true. Owen didn't attend those meetings. He hadn't realized she'd been trying to organize a trail system through a portion of county land that skirted the edge of his property. He certainly hadn't known that someone had drawn up a proposal to connect that trail system through a decades-old logging road that crossed into his north boundary, land that had been on his family's deed for nearly 80 years. When he returned home and began combing through his documents, what he found unsettled him. Somewhere in the last 12 months, county GIS maps had been updated. Not drastically, but enough. Enough to make it look, on a quick glance, that the logging road and the adjoining game trail were unassigned, or public access pending. It wasn't an outright theft, not in a legal sense. No one had changed his deed. But someone had created a shadow layer of suggestion. Just enough ambiguity to allow a community group to argue that the space was a gray zone. And in that grayness, people like Karen thrived. Owen considered his options. He could call the county office and demand clarification, but he knew from experience that any answer would be vague and unhelpful. He could speak to a lawyer, but litigation would be slow, expensive, and publicly visible. He hated the thought of drawing more attention to something that should never have become an issue. Most of all, he hated the thought of being made into an example, because that's what this was becoming, a push to create precedent. If they could fine him once, they could fine him again. If they could walk the edge of his land and call it shared space, then eventually it would be. The pressure wasn't random, it was strategic, soft erosion masked as public benefit. And then there was the fine. $2,500, due in 30 days, or he would be referred to a community compliance panel, whatever that meant. The language in the letter wasn't legal. It was administrative. But that didn't make it less dangerous. Bureaucracies didn't need law to grind people down. They needed just enough noise, enough confusion to wear someone out. Owen had watched it happen to neighbors before. People who'd fought over fence lines, setbacks, road rights. In the end, they sold, worn thin, tired of fighting a system that didn't punch, but smothered. But Owen wasn't tired. Not yet. What angered him wasn't the accusation itself. It was the arrogance, the presumption that he would accept this, that he would be cowed by a piece of paper and the collective frowning of people who'd never walked more than 20 yards into his forest. They thought him isolated, vulnerable, easy to frame as the stubborn outsider, and maybe he was all those things. But he was also methodical, patient, and unafraid of escalation as long as it was on his terms. So he sat down at his desk, lit the kerosene lamp his grandfather had used during snowstorms, and began drafting a list. Not of enemies, not of retaliation, but of assets. He reviewed his property line again, every corner post and survey pin. He cataloged every adjacent lot, every unclaimed parcel within a mile radius. He looked not at what they were trying to take, but at what they might need, at what they believed was already theirs, and what it would cost them when they found out otherwise. The following week brought no relief. Owen didn't expect an apology, of course, but he had hoped that the situation would simply quiet down on its own, that perhaps the fine had been a one-off overreaction, a poorly researched complaint pushed through by an overzealous neighborhood committee trying to impress itself. But if that had ever been a possibility, it vanished completely the moment he received a second letter. This one bore the same gold-trimmed seal, but the language had shifted. It wasn't a fine this time. It was a notice of continued non-compliance. It referenced not just the hunting incident, but now claimed that Owen had erected physical barriers on a corridor of provisional access to community recreational property, and that such actions may result in restricted use sanctions or further legal review under the Community Ordinance Extension Act. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but the implication was serious. He was being treated not as a property owner with legal autonomy, but as someone who had violated a collective rulebook he'd never agreed to read. He stood at the kitchen table staring at the paper as the late morning light spilled across the pine-scratched surface. He didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. There was no mention of specific parcels, no legal citations, no attached map or coordinates, just language so vague it could mean anything. And yet, it came with teeth. A warning. They were documenting his resistance. This wasn't about hunting. It had become something else entirely. A posture. A test of whether he would fold or fight. Later that afternoon, Owen drove into the county seat. He walked up the cracked stone steps of the Land Records office and requested a full extract of every map revision, zoning adjustment, and easement application made within the last 18 months. The woman behind the counter gave him a tired look but didn't argue. When she returned 20 minutes later with a heavy folder, he thanked her, paid the copy fee in cash, and took the documents to his truck. He sat in the cab for almost an hour, engine off, flipping through pages. Most of it was bureaucratic filler. Updates to road widths, mailbox regulations, setbacks for new developments. But tucked between a series of minor adjustments was a curious entry. Conditional Access Route Application. Community Recreation Overlay Initiative. The area described was vague but suggested a corridor that intersected the old Forest Service, trail bordering Owen's north perimeter. It had been proposed 6 months earlier. Pending community support and environmental review. There was no signature, no attached survey, no recorded opposition. That's when Owen realized the plan hadn't been to confront him directly. Not yet. They hadn't filed anything enforceable. They'd merely created a paper trail, an implied presence, a bureaucratic ghost waiting to become real through repetition. The letters, the public complaints, the revised maps, they were all precursors. Pressure, perception. If enough people believed a trail existed, then in time it would. Not legally, not in any court that mattered, but socially. And once public consensus was established, it was only a matter of time before the county's rubber stamps followed. Back home, Owen began to walk his boundaries again, not as a man checking fences, but as a strategist walking a chessboard. He stopped at every game camera he'd mounted along the trails, checked the memory cards, cataloged every image from the past 3 months. Nothing looked out of place. The same wandering deer, the same tracks of fox and raccoon, but still he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. Not in the woods, but in the way people were thinking about them. 3 days later, the first hikers appeared. They came in the early morning, 3 women and a man, dressed in expensive hiking gear with poles and hydration packs, following what Owen knew had once been a logging switchback. They didn't enter from the official trailhead near the county road. They came from the side, cutting through brush, stepping over felled logs, making their way into the eastern gulch that clearly marked private land. Owen saw them from a distance and watched, not from anger, but from cold disbelief. They were casual, unhurried, and carried with them an air of assumed entitlement, as though they had been told, perhaps by a cheerful neighbor or a green-signed community bulletin, that this path was for public use. One of the women even stopped to photograph a tree marked with an old survey ribbon, Owen's ribbon, and pointed at it like it was part of a guided nature walk. He didn't approach them. He didn't shout or brandish his firearm or storm down to assert his rights. Instead, he quietly took a photograph of his own, from a distance, time-stamped and geo-located. When they left, he followed their route backward and discovered something even more troubling. Someone had moved one of the corner markers. Not broken it, not stolen it, just shifted it by several feet. Enough to redirect a path. Enough to blur the line between invitation and intrusion. That evening, he called a private surveying firm from Salem. He knew their rates would be high, but at this point, clarity was worth the price. He needed not just a copy of his boundary, but a registered, GPS-verified update that could be filed and referenced as a definitive rebuttal to the encroaching narrative. The survey team arrived 3 days later and worked for 2 full days, deploying modern equipment, drones and precision markers that would be impossible to dispute. When they were finished, Owen requested notarized documentation and a digital overlay for future court use. The lead surveyor, an older man with sunburned hands and sharp eyes, simply said, "Someone's trying to box you in. You're smart to move early." But even as Owen began to feel some ground under his feet, the campaign against him continued to evolve. That weekend, a community update newsletter arrived in nearby mailboxes. He only saw a copy because his old friend Rick, a retired lineman who still lived in the town's original sector, dropped it off on his porch with a handwritten note. "Thought you'd want to see this, bud. Looks like they're naming names now." Inside the newsletter, there was an entire column titled Wildlands, Wildlife, and Community Safety. The piece talked about unregulated zones, untracked wildlife behaviors, and the danger of rural property owners who resist cooperation. Though no names were used explicitly, it described a large northern property where a recent firearm incident involving a predator animal caused distress among residents. It ended with a quote from Karen Holbrook herself. "We believe that access to nature should never come at the cost of public safety. Our children and pets deserve peace, not gunfire." Owen sat with the newsletter in his lap for a long time. He wasn't enraged, not yet, but something deeper had begun to settle into his bones. A growing awareness that he was being recast, redefined in a narrative that wasn't his. They weren't trying to win a case, they were trying to write a new script. And in that version of the story, he was the threat, the hermit with guns, the uncooperative landowner, the man who stood in the way of progress and community spirit. It was subtle, it was smart, and it was dangerous. And yet, in the quiet of his living room, as the wood stove crackled and the wind pressed against the windows, Owen felt the opposite of fear. He felt focus, cold, patient, and deliberate. He knew now what they wanted. The trail wasn't a destination. It was a wedge, an entry point, a foothold. If they could claim even a sliver of his land, or even argue that he was adjacent to public use zones, they could begin to normalize their presence. First came access, then regulation, then expectation, and then, eventually, he'd find himself walking his own forest like a guest. That wasn't going to happen. Not here. Not while he still drew breath. By the end of the month, the tone of the conflict had hardened. What had begun as passive pressure wrapped in administrative language now revealed itself with clearer edges, sharpened not just by words but by movement, by patterns of behavior too intentional to be dismissed as coincidence. Owen noticed it first in the way vehicles slowed near his southern gate, where the old gravel road intersected the county-maintained loop. Most days it was nothing. A county truck, a delivery van. But more and more, he saw unfamiliar SUVs with tinted windows coasting past his entrance, pausing briefly, sometimes backing up as if re-evaluating their bearings. At first, he chalked it up to hikers getting lost. Then he began to recognize the same vehicle more than once, sometimes parked along the tree line, lights off, engine idling. There was no law against parking on public roads. No one got out, no one knocked, and no one trespassed. But it was enough to signal intention, a message wrapped in legality, daring him to react. Owen didn't take the bait. He didn't confront the vehicles or follow them, though he documented every one. He installed discrete cameras, small enough to escape attention but sharp enough to catch license plates and timestamps. When he cross-checked some of the plates through a contact he still had in the municipal planning office, a man who owed him a favor from a land use survey years back, he confirmed what he already suspected. Several of the vehicles were registered to families involved with the so-called Ecological Association, including one that belonged to Karen Holbrook herself. They weren't just curious. They were collecting information, watching his habits, mapping the way he lived. The real escalation came not with threats or direct confrontation, but with signage. It started overnight. Owen woke one morning and walked the northern stretch of his land as he did every Friday, only to find a new post driven into the earth near the edge of the logging trail. It was sleek and metallic, capped with a reflective surface, and bore a laminated notice that read, "Community Access Pathway. Low Impact Entry Encouraged." At the bottom, in small print, "Maintained under Pine Brook Ecological Cooperative Zone 3. The name wasn't a legal entity. It didn't exist in any registry. But it sounded official. It sounded intentional. And it was designed to fool the casual hiker into thinking this was approved public land. Owen stood before the sign for several minutes, unmoving. The ground was still soft around the post. It had been installed recently, possibly that same morning. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no indication of who had carried it in. But the message was clear. They were no longer waiting for permission or negotiating perception. They were planting facts into the ground, daring him to challenge the story they were creating. He removed the sign carefully, not destroying it, but wrapping it in a tarp and placing it in his shed. That afternoon, he sent a letter through his attorney, not to Karen, not to the Ecological Board, but directly to the county commissioner's office and the zoning authority. The letter demanded clarification on whether any easement or land use permit had been granted over the past 60 days regarding his property. It also included GPS coordinates of the post, a photograph of the sign, and a full copy of his deed, including the notarized survey conducted weeks earlier. 3 days passed without response. On the 4th day, the sign was back. Identical wording, identical formatting. But this time, it appeared 100 feet deeper into his land, in a shaded clearing near a natural spring. It had been staked into the ground with heavier bolts and coated in a waterproof resin. Next to it was a small bench, brand new, anchored to a poured concrete slab with smooth edges. The kind of bench designed not for rest, but for permanence. This was not a prank. Owen took photographs of the scene, uploaded everything to an encrypted drive, and contacted his lawyer again. The man's voice was clipped, direct. He had worked land disputes before, but even he admitted that this approach was unusual in how organized it appears. He recommended filing an immediate cease and desist order, along with a formal trespassing report. Owen agreed. They would proceed with both. But even as the legal wheels began to turn, Owen knew that the group's next move would not be delayed by bureaucracy. He was right. A week later, just past dawn, Owen heard the unmistakable crack of brush being pushed aside. He was in his tool shed, preparing to install additional fence posts along the eastern side of the property, when he stepped outside and saw 2 figures near the western ridge, standing where the pines thinned out near a rock outcropping. They weren't hiking. They weren't armed. They were wearing reflective vests, hard hats, and carried clipboards. Surveyors, private ones by the look of their gear. Owen approached carefully, not yelling, not brandishing anything. As he got closer, one of them looked up and gave a forced, apologetic smile. "Hey there. Sorry if we startled you. We're conducting a preliminary scan for a low-impact trail system initiative. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." Owen didn't answer. He stopped 5 yards from them, hands at his sides, and asked a single question. "Who sent you?" The taller one, clearly in charge, hesitated. "We were contracted by the Pine Brook Ecological Committee. They filed an exploratory mapping permit last month." "You're standing on my land," Owen said, his voice calm but iron hard. "You're not here legally. You will leave now. You will not return. And if you've taken any readings or GPS logs, you will delete them." The man looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Owen's stance, or perhaps the silence behind his words, made him think better of it. They packed up quickly. No complaints, no threats. Just the tight, efficient retreat of professionals who had miscalculated their welcome. That night, Owen installed motion sensors along the western slope. It had taken them less than 2 months to transition from letters to presence. from implication to incursion. What concerned him most wasn't their boldness. It was the methodical pacing of their actions. They weren't rushing. They were testing him, pushing inch by inch, just enough to avoid open conflict. But Owen had read enough history to know how these battles were lost. Not in courts, not in standoffs, but in fatigue. In letting the other side set the rhythm. He wouldn't allow it. The next day, Owen made a quiet call to a regional private security contractor. Not ex-military, not flashy, but a company known for handling sensitive land stewardship and protective observation in remote areas. He didn't want mercenaries. He wanted watchmen, licensed, discreet, and accountable. They drew up a month-to-month contract, and within 48 hours a team of 2 was patrolling the perimeter in marked vehicles. No weapons visible. No threats issued. Just presence. The way the other side had done it. But real. By the end of the week, the sign installation stopped. Owen knew it wouldn't last. The group would retreat, recalculate, and find a new approach. But for the first time since this had begun, the initiative had shifted. They were reacting to him now. And, more importantly, the message was being rewritten. This land was not up for discussion. It had an owner, and he was watching. The legal process would continue. Letters would go back and forth. The cease and desist would stall in committee. The zoning requests would be delayed. But Owen understood now that his real defense wasn't in paperwork. It was in tempo, in proving that for every quiet strategic move they made, he would respond. Not louder, but sharper. Not emotionally, but with structure, with preparation. This was no longer a question of land. It was a test of who would outlast whom. And Owen had built his life on silence, solitude, and time. He could wait longer than any of them. By midsummer, the tension that had begun as a slow undercurrent had congealed into something denser, something that settled over Owen's land like fog that refused to lift. The patrols continued, rotating with quiet efficiency, 2 men in shifts, keeping eyes on the access trails, logging all movement with body-worn cameras and high-range optics. For weeks, the presence alone had been enough to deter further incursions. No new signs appeared, no surveyors returned, and no hikers strayed beyond the true public boundary. But Owen understood that the silence wasn't surrender. It was recalibration. And he was right. It was during a meeting with his attorney that the next move surfaced. Not through a direct threat, but a document buried in a planning committee's monthly agenda. An environmental reclamation partnership application, submitted by a nonprofit, an affiliate of the Pinebrook Group, seeking to secure grant funding to restore a historic public access trail lost to unregulated private development. The trail in question wasn't named, but the coordinates left no ambiguity. It was the logging path that ran like a scar across Owen's northern ridge. And despite the fact that he still held the title, still paid taxes on that land, the application described it as a disputed region, requiring formal review by the Office of Recreational Planning. Owen stared at the document, jaw clenched. The only sound in the office, the slow clicking of his attorney's pen against a legal pad. It's procedural poison, the lawyer finally said. They're not trying to take the land directly. They're trying to trigger a regulatory audit, force a zoning hold, and make you defend a right you've never lost. It's a war of exhaustion. The man flipped the page and pointed at the signatures. And it's got Karen Holbrook's name on it, right there with her husband's foundation. That name carries weight. They're lining up public health consultants, retired biologists, and eco-tourism planners, people who know how to talk to bureaucrats. This isn't about truth anymore. It's about presentation. For the first time, Owen felt the strain not in his chest or mind, but in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't losing, not yet, but he was being pulled into a theater where facts mattered less than optics, where perception shaped reality, and where delays could become permanence. Later that week, he made a decision that would shift the entire rhythm of the conflict. There had always been one weak point in his defenses, not legal or structural, but conceptual, a gap in the symbolic power of his presence. As long as the public believed the path might still be open, might still be claimable, they would test it, prod its edges, imagine its future. So Owen did the unthinkable. He removed ambiguity. Through a shell company set up by his council, he quietly purchased the 10-acre parcel adjacent to the north boundary, an odd, triangular strip that included the original access point to the disputed trail. It had been neglected for decades, its title floating in legal limbo after the original owners died intestate. No one had cared about it, until now. Once the purchase cleared, Owen filed an immediate land use notice reclassifying the area as a restricted use conservation buffer, designating it as a sensitive ecological transition zone. It was a technical move, dry and bureaucratic, but its effect was thunderous. The only viable public approach to the so-called community trail had just been legally severed. Access no longer existed. Not socially, not physically, not administratively. The path was closed. To enforce it, Owen installed a physical barrier, not flashy, not militarized, but unmistakable. A gated access point with motion-triggered cameras, a solar-powered security post, and a laminated statement of restricted entry citing state conservation. Regulations. It didn't threaten anyone. It didn't imply violence. But it made one thing clear. This land was no longer in question. It had a purpose. It had a guardian. And it was not up for discussion. The reaction was swift. Within days, Karen Holbrook filed a complaint with the County Land Board, accusing Owen of deliberate obstruction of communal pathways and intimidation through privatization. The language was inflammatory, designed for headlines, not hearings. She accused him of creating an armed zone, of undermining the community's emotional relationship with the land, of acting against the spirit of shared ecology. And for the first time, local news outlets took notice. Not national networks or viral blogs, but community papers, blogs run by hobbyists, Facebook groups filled with retirees and activists. Most of them repeated Karen's statements word for word, never once checking the legal facts. One article ran a photo of Owen's Gate, taken from the public road with a telephoto lens, framed in such a way that it looked like the entrance to a compound. The headline read, "Private Militarization of the Forest. Has one man gone too far?" Owen didn't respond. He didn't issue a statement or call a press conference. He didn't call the editor or write a rebuttal. Instead, he continued exactly as before, walking his land, maintaining the perimeter, logging the activity of birds and coyotes, pruning invasive ivy. But inside, something had shifted. Not fear, not even anger, just a deepening awareness of what this had become. This wasn't a legal battle. It wasn't even political. It was existential. A war of stories. And he had finally realized he didn't need to win over the county or convince the neighborhood. He only needed to deny the other side their narrative. They wanted to build an illusion of inevitability, of shared inevitability. He would fracture that illusion, not with speeches or protests, but with quiet, relentless refusal. He had lived on that land longer than anyone else in the area. He had mapped it with his feet, cared for it with his hands, preserved its balance not out of ideology but out of responsibility. Now he would defend it not as a fighter, but as a keeper, and he understood the paradox. Sometimes the only way to protect peace was to show, beyond any doubt, that you were willing to hold the line. Autumn arrived with a slow, creeping finality, the kind that doesn't announce itself with color or cold, but with a shift in the silence. Birds migrating in tighter groups, wind that lingered longer in the tree line, and mornings where breath hung, briefly in the air before vanishing. On Owen's land, the change was welcome. It signaled the season of stillness, a time when casual hikers disappeared and only the dedicated kept to trails. For a while, it gave the illusion that things had settled. There were no new letters, no new markers staked into the earth, no fresh attempts at soft invasion. But beneath that lull, the campaign continued in another form, more dangerous and insidious because it moved through channels not of force, but of influence, shaping the environment around him in ways that didn't seem like attacks until their patterns became impossible to ignore. It began with services. Deliveries that had previously arrived without issue, fuel, lumber, maintenance parts, started missing his address in the logistics network. When Owen called the suppliers, they apologized profusely and insisted his location was no longer confirmed in the database, or worse, flagged as remote risk zone. One even mentioned that a community profile had flagged the area for access instability. That phrase stuck with him. Access instability. Bureaucratic language engineered to sound neutral while undermining credibility. He checked public registries and found that his address had, in fact, been relabeled in a municipal infrastructure report as a Tier 3 corridor, designating it as non-essential and subject to seasonal service restriction. No public vote. No notification. Just an updated classification that altered the ecosystem of support he'd relied on for decades. And it wasn't limited to goods. His broadband provider informed him that due to a regional bandwidth reallocation, they could no longer guarantee consistent service. The week after that, his satellite data platform notified him that topographic overlays of his zone would no longer be prioritized due to lower aggregate usage demands. Owen began to understand the shape of the attack. They weren't coming through the front gate anymore. They were draining the groundwater, removing context, convenience, and access, drying out the veins of support until living there became not impossible, but increasingly difficult. Not enough to force him out, just enough to make it seem like leaving would be easier. Strategic suffocation. It was brilliant in its own way, and it had Karen Holbrook written all over it. She was no longer hiding behind committee titles or vague coalitions. Emboldened by her traction in local media and the administrative deadlock that Owen's cease and desist had landed in, she had become a fixture at county meetings, giving statements about rural responsibility, pushing for stricter environmental standards, and leveraging her husband's old philanthropic foundation to fund observation projects and community restoration monitoring. In a speech recorded by a local high school journalism club and circulated online, she described Owen's perimeter installations as fortifications, his security team as a paramilitary presence, and his conservation easement filings as paper walls designed to divide. She never said his name, but the references were unmistakable. Worse, she used rhetorical framing that turned his silence into guilt. Why, she asked, would someone need guards on their trail? Why would someone close nature off from the very people who want to love it? Owen watched the clip once and turned it off. He knew better than to respond. Any public statement would only fuel the perception of conflict. He didn't care what they believed about his motives, but what he did care about, what he could no longer ignore, was the slow spread of physical trespass. The return of footprints, the smell of wood smoke on the air from fires that hadn't come from his chimney. The first one he found was in the eastern grove, a crude, makeshift fire pit lined with stones and blackened in the center. It had been recently used, though whoever built it had covered the ashes with dirt and pine needles. 2 weeks later, he found a discarded camping mat and 2 crushed energy drink cans buried under a false floor of moss and bark beneath the old ranger tower. It wasn't kids. It was too clean, too careful. Someone had stayed, watched, and left with enough caution to avoid confrontation, but not enough to avoid detection. That was the moment Owen changed posture. Up until then, he had responded to every intrusion with documentation, legal pushback, and physical containment. Now he turned to proactive strategy. He met with his security team and ordered round-the-clock rotation with no gaps, non-aggressive but absolute. He added infrared trail cams at every logical approach vector and had his lawyer file a motion to require the county to clarify their position on access classifications. At the same time, he initiated a second acquisition. There was a long-neglected parcel of land, a narrow serpentine strip that followed the base of a ravine west of his main property. It had no surface value, no road access, and had been left out of the community development plans entirely. But it served one vital function. It bordered the original trailhead the Pinebrook Group had claimed as heritage public access. By purchasing it, Owen didn't just block entry. He buried the last piece of their historical claim. With that one move, he converted their rhetorical symbol into private easement, legally untouchable. The blowback was immediate. Karen filed an injunction alleging malicious territorial expansion and claimed that Owen's new acquisition violated the spirit of the public interest. Her complaint cited obscure environmental clauses, trying to tie his land use to regional wetland migration patterns. But the law was on his side. The parcel had been on auction for 9 months. No one had bid, and now it was his. What followed was no longer just media noise. It was confrontation. 3 strangers appeared at his gate one afternoon. Not neighbors, not hikers, men in nondescript outdoor gear who claimed to be evaluators for a regional trail mapping initiative. When Owen asked for ID, they refused. When he warned them they were on private property, they quoted lines from the community charter, not law, not regulation, but phrases like presumed civic right-of-way and historical implied access. One of them attempted to step forward until Owen's security lead, a calm, soft-spoken man named Rivas, stepped in front of him and quietly informed them that further movement would be considered trespass. The men left, but only after filming the entire encounter, muttering legal jargon as they retreated. 2 nights later, a drone appeared over Owen's land. Silent, high range, equipped with infrared. He watched its shadow flicker across the pines from his second-story window and marked its flight pattern. He didn't shoot it down. He didn't even interfere. But the next day, he forwarded the video to his lawyer and then to a former colleague in the FAA, who helped him initiate a report citing aerial harassment and unauthorized data capture over protected private land. He knew it might not stop them, but it raised the stakes, made their presence official, traceable. And then, finally, Karen overplayed her hand. In an open statement during a county council Q&A, she proposed the formation of a Community Access Task Force, a hybrid entity that would work with landowners to reassess boundaries, intentions, and barriers to ecological participation. She framed it as a friendly solution, a bridge-building initiative. But when pressed, she revealed its real purpose: compulsory arbitration. Under the proposal, landowners with more than 100 acres bordering recreational corridors would be required to submit to environmental review panels and open mediation about future land use. It was, in essence, a soft form of eminent domain, a forced negotiation under the pretense of communal harmony. Owen's lawyer called him the same night, practically livid. "They're trying to codify pressure," he said. "Wrap it in policy and see if they can slip it through committee while no one's watching." Owen didn't wait. He contacted 3 adjacent landowners, people who had been watching his fight from the sidelines, and together they formed a private land stewardship cooperative. Within a week, they filed a formal declaration with the county, invoking their rights under the Oregon Landowner Autonomy Act, which protected private ecological management zones from external interference without express consent. It was an old statute, rarely used but still valid, and it was a shield. The declaration was picked up by a regional property rights advocacy group, who published a piece detailing the timeline of the harassment, the bureaucratic encroachments, and the illegal mapping attempts. They didn't name Karen, but the implication was clear. And while the article didn't go viral, it circulated among the right circles: landowners, planners, legal observers. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive. Her public image began to fracture. Not collapse, but fracture. Enough for board members to start asking questions. Enough for the whispers to start. What's her end game? Is this still about trails, or something else? Owen didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply reinforced his perimeter one last time. And he waited. Because the war wasn't over, but the tide had shifted, and he had no intention of letting it turn again. The cold set in fast that year, dropping down from the mountains like a warning, and with it came the culmination Owen had been anticipating for weeks, perhaps even months. Everything about the rhythm of the conflict suggested an impending strike. Karen's sudden absence from county appearances, the abrupt halt of new public statements, the silence in local forums that had previously churned with curated outrage. It was not surrender. It was coordination. He recognized the pattern not because he was paranoid, but because he had learned over time how institutional systems escalated when visibility dropped. They prepared to act through official channels, not noise. What arrived wasn't a squad of inspectors or a lawsuit. It was a letter, but not like the ones that had come before. This one bore the state seal and was signed by a deputy administrator from the Office of Environmental Integrity. It informed Owen that his land had been designated for a preliminary survey under the Wildlands and Public Coexistence Strategy, and that a field team would be granted temporary access rights under authority of the Regional Planning Board. The letter included dates, team credentials, and a disclaimer that the survey was non-binding, observational, and intended to foster cooperative stewardship. It was a masterstroke of soft invasion, a bureaucratic chess move that positioned itself as benign while legally encroaching. Owen read the letter 3 times, then forwarded it to his attorney, who confirmed the worst. While the survey itself carried no immediate legal power, refusing entry would trigger a hearing that could position him as obstructive under a community integration clause. In simpler terms, if he said no, they could label him uncooperative and cite him for resisting administrative review. It wouldn't strip his rights, but it would create the foundation for more aggressive action later. He would lose not the land, but control of the narrative around it, and from there, the rest could erode. But Owen had prepared for this. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He complied, on paper. He responded through his attorney, confirming receipt of the notice and stating that access would be granted under limited supervision consistent with private property rights and safety protocols. He offered a time, a date, and a designated route. When the state team arrived, they did so in 2 SUVs marked with department logos, 4 individuals wearing state-issued jackets, their faces calm, neutral, polite. Owen greeted them without expression and directed them along a cleared path that led nowhere meaningful, a loop that passed through a deliberately unimpressive section of his forest where invasive brush had overgrown and old fire damage remained. Untouched, it was a calculated choice, presenting them with disrepair rather than pristine habitat, leaving no fertile ground for ecological valor or public trail fantasies. He walked with them the entire way, answering their questions with clipped accuracy, offering no embellishments and making no attempt to charm or antagonize. He was there not to cooperate, but to neutralize. The lead inspector, a young man with careful posture and bureaucratic diction, made notes without comment. When they returned to the vehicles, he thanked Owen for his time and said that the findings would be reviewed and compiled for internal assessment. What followed was 3 weeks of silence. No reports, no media, no feedback. But Owen wasn't fooled. He increased security patrols to 24-hour rotations and doubled the off-grid surveillance captures. He knew better than to assume quiet meant retreat. The attack, when it came, was indirect. An article in a state-level publication known for spotlighting environmental policy. The piece, written anonymously, discussed the growing tension between conservation needs and stubborn private ownership. It did not mention Owen by name, but referenced a large tract of inherited forest land in northern Oregon whose owner has refused integration under the Wildlands Initiative. It quoted an unnamed source suggesting the land could serve regional restoration goals and public recreation purposes under guided administration. The article was strategic. It framed the issue not as legal but moral, not about ownership but obligation. It ended with a chilling line. In an age where land is legacy, the question is not who holds the title, but who holds the vision. Owen read it twice, then burned the paper in his stove. The next morning, one of his security team reported fresh tire tracks near the lower service road, a path that had been blocked off and sealed 2 months prior. The tracks didn't match any of the team's vehicles. More disturbing was what lay at the end of the trail, a small fire pit, still warm, surrounded by the faint imprint of heavy boots. Someone had been there recently, close enough to scout the perimeter, bold enough to linger. It was not a homeless camp or hunter's rest. It was reconnaissance. He filed an official trespass report with the sheriff's office, not because he expected action, but to document the escalation. He also submitted the data logs from the fire pit to his legal team, who immediately compiled the incident with the state article as part of a potential pre-litigation case. Then, without announcement or bravado, Owen enacted his final countermeasure. He had held it in reserve for exactly this scenario, a final assertion of authority that wouldn't just defend his land but redefine its status. He activated the full scope of his conservation designation and entered into a private contract with a federal-level rewilding initiative, an elite ecological project focused on controlled sanctuary development in underused rural parcels. The contract shifted the operational status of his land from private residential to conservation partner, giving it the same protections as federal grazing lands or research zones. Under the terms of the agreement, unauthorized access could now be treated as interference with a federally affiliated site. It changed everything. 2 days after the contract was filed, his lawyer received a request from the Office of Environmental Integrity asking to delay any further survey evaluations until current status verifications could be confirmed. Translation: they'd been blindsided. The game board had changed without warning, and now they didn't know the rules. Owen didn't celebrate. He simply walked his northern ridge that evening and stood at the edge of the old logging trail, the place where this had all begun. The path was quiet now, overgrown again, reclaimed by bramble and time, and he felt, not triumph, but alignment, a sense that the land had finally absorbed his defense and settled. But the fight wasn't quite over. That night, around midnight, an alarm tripped on the southern camera grid. Rivas and his partner responded within 5 minutes, finding nothing but disturbed brush and a trail of light boot impressions in the soil. No confrontation, no faces. Just presence. It was the last gasp of a narrative trying to survive a battlefield that no longer existed. Because Owen hadn't just won the legal argument, he'd changed the status of the conversation. They could no longer say it was about trails or access. Now it was about jurisdiction, and that was a game they couldn't win without starting over from scratch. Owen didn't speak about the outcome to anyone, not even his lawyer. There would be final paperwork, loose ends, future audits. But the campaign was over, not because they'd admitted defeat, but because he had closed every door they thought they could slip through. The land was his, not just in title, but in definition. And now it had walls they couldn't see, protections they couldn't bypass, and a guardian they could no longer outmaneuver. The snow came late that year, as if the land itself had waited for everything else to settle before laying down its final white silence. It fell in a slow, continuous hush, covering the last traces of intrusion, the footprints near the southern trail, the tire marks at the edge of the ravine, and even the old burn circle where strangers had once camped in quiet defiance. Owen watched it all disappear from his cabin window, the world outside softening into stillness, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to stop measuring risk. There were no more letters, no more meetings, no sudden reclassifications or announcements of trail expansions. Karen Holbrook had stepped back from public activity, her name notably absent from the latest minutes of the Ecological Council and the Land Use Subcommittee. The newsletter that once ran fervent opinion pieces now printed updates about seasonal composting tips and lost dogs. The silence wasn't victory in the traditional sense. There were no public apologies, no admissions of fault, but it was the kind that mattered more, the end of pressure, the end of doubt. Owen didn't remove the guards. He scaled them down, transitioned from active patrol to monitoring mode, reducing presence without removing structure. He knew better than to believe peace was permanent. What he had learned through the long, quiet war was that land, when unprotected by noise, invited projection. People filled it with what they wanted it to be: a shared path, a resource, a stage for their own values. But land, real land, required definition, not just on paper, but in action. That was what he had done. Not just kept it, but defined it so precisely, so undeniably, that the illusion had nowhere left to attach. He hadn't won by proving his point. He had won by removing their canvas. One day in early December, as the last leaves gave up their hold on the trees, a county vehicle drove slowly up the front access road. Owen stepped out to meet it, dressed not in intimidation but in the layered calm of someone who no longer had to prepare for confrontation. The driver, a middle-aged man with cautious eyes and a clipboard, introduced himself as a regional land assessor following up on an archived site status. He wasn't confrontational. In fact, he was almost embarrassed to be there. "We're cleaning up old initiative records," he explained, trying to clarify the difference between community trail proposals and confirmed development areas. "Just wanted to verify if you're still classified under the conservation program." Owen handed him the federal contract, signed, filed, and sealed. The man looked it over, nodded, and thanked him. As he turned to go, he paused and added quietly, "You're the only one who actually filed everything clean. It's rare." Owen didn't reply. He watched the vehicle retreat down the road, its tracks already vanishing under the fresh snow, and turned back toward the cabin. Inside, everything was as it had always been: quiet, functional, precise. He made coffee the old way, set the fire, and opened the latest wildlife log. There were new signs of a cougar near the western edge, and the mule deer herds had shifted migration routes, probably due to early ice along the ridgeline. He noted the changes, adjusted his maps, and reviewed the solar efficiency data from the last storm. There were no dramatic moments, no grand speeches, just work. The same work he'd done for years. But now, he did it without interruption, without distortion. And as he finished writing for the day, he thought, not about what had been taken from him because nothing truly had, but about what he had protected. Not just boundaries, not just trees or trails, but continuity, the right to carry forward something unspoken, to live in alignment with the land, not as its master, but as its keeper. He had never asked to become a symbol, and in truth, he hadn't. Symbols required visibility. Owen had remained almost invisible throughout. That was his power. In a world obsessed with spectacle, he had chosen the quiet road, and he had walked it, alone, until no one dared try to draw a map over it again.